All right. Hello, everyone. Today is our, should be just like near the start of our week on engineering ethics, right? For our segment on ethics across the professions. So today we're going to be talking about risk and safety and accidents and how engineers bear a responsibility to minimize risk, minimize the number of accidents that could occur from use of a product, and to overall promote safety when it comes to designing products. Okay, so first of all, um, our author wants to make note of this notion that engineers have a general moral duty to make their products as safe as can be reasonably expected, right? So for instance, if it's going to take like $3 million to make a product just like a little tiny bit safer, maybe that benefit does not outweigh the cost that has to go into it for like a marginal benefit, right? So the idea is that we want it to be as safe as reasonably expected, right? It doesn't have to be maximally safe, right? So the chapter starts with a case. ValueJet Flight 592, there were like these oxygen tanks that weren't secured right and had these design flaws, and through a whole slew of mistakes, um, the plane ended up crashing and everybody on board died. Right, it's a sad story, but you can read about it in the text. But ValueJet 592, Flight 592, is the result of a high risk situation that was full of accidents, right? So we'll talk about accidents momentarily, but let's talk a little bit about what risk and safety are. So the duty to make products as safe as they can be or reasonably expected to be involves minimizing risk, right? With use of the product, right? It involves minimizing of various unsafe outcomes when one is operating, say, this product. So we say that a car is safer when, say, when the car is in a wreck, the driver is okay most of the time, right? That's a safer car than a car that when you drive it, the driver almost always dies, something like that, or maintains lots of injury. We would say that's a riskier car, more unsafe car to drive. So the idea of risk and safety they are kind of conceptually opposed. Like where you have more risk, you have less safety, and where you have more safety, you have less risk, right? Um, Kind of an intuitive concept, but something our author notes. Okay, so let's talk about a few terms, and we can talk about these as we talk about other concepts and other cases. So first, there's a difference between a voluntary and an involuntary risk. Voluntary risks are things that we know going in, and we anticipate those risks as potential outcomes, whereas an involuntary risk is something that we do not choose to take on. Voluntary risks, according to Flederman, are safer than involuntary risks. So if we have some notion that there is some unsafe potential outcome, somehow that makes it less risky, right? Maybe we're more prone to be like to try and avoid that outcome, right? So we act in a different way than we would if we didn't know that that outcome was there, that risky outcome was there. I'm not really sure why he thinks this, but the idea is that voluntary risks are somehow safer than involuntary ones. We can also distinguish between short-term and long-term risks. So a short-term risk might be something that like happens very immediately. So for instance, um, if I get into a car accident, I could get hurt. This is a short-term. Oh, excuse me, I'm getting confused here. Sorry. A short-term risk is like a risk that we can recover from, right? We can get back to normal after a certain amount of time, whereas what's called a long-term risk is a risk with an outcome that changes us permanently, right? So for instance, I could fall down at work and like maybe say break my leg. That's like a real risk, right? Um, but suppose that at work there's an equal chance that I could like fall down and be permanently paralyzed. It seems like being permanently paralyzed, which is the long-term risk, is like worse. It's riskier, it's the dispreferred outcome, right? And so the general idea here is that long-term risks are more risky than short-term ones, okay? Because short-term risks, we will eventually get back to normal, whereas long-term risks, we will not. And then, okay, our author talks about expected probability. This is like the chances of a risk occurring or the chances of a negative outcome happening. And if the expected probability is like low enough, well, then that like will diminish a lot of the risks, right? So if the probability of a bad outcome is really high, that's like a riskier activity versus if the probability of a bad outcome is like low, it like becomes less risky, right? Okay. More terms, we could talk about reversible effects. So reversible effects are effects or outcomes that can be removed, right? That can be changed. And this makes an activity or an outcome much less risky, right? So if there's a bad outcome, but if the bad outcome happens, we can just alleviate it, right? Or change it or remove it. Well, then it becomes less risky. Then there's the threshold level of risk. Um, this is an activity that has, so there are some activities that have a threshold, right? And you can have exposure underneath the threshold and be fine. But if you're above the threshold, it then becomes dangerous. So for instance, taking in, say, trace amounts of like uh, air from, say, a nuclear plant, right? It's going to have like marginal health effects and maybe even like some beneficial health effects, right? And it's not until we reach a certain point that taking in air from a nuclear power plant like becomes dangerous, right? So underneath a certain threshold, we're fine. But once we reach that threshold, all of a sudden it becomes dangerous. This is different from an activity where any exposure is going to have a negative health risk. So suppose that even a trace amount of arsenic is going to poison you and kill you, right? Then there's no threshold effect, right? Once you even engage with a little bit of it, you are at risk, right? You are going to be exposed to the bad outcome. So the idea here is that activities that don't involve a threshold level of risk are riskier than ones that do, right? Than ones that have a uniform level of risk at any level of exposure. And then finally, we have delayed versus immediate risk. Activities with an immediate bad outcome tend to be riskier than activities with delayed outcomes, right? So think of smoking. Smoking has delayed outcomes. And so I think we would treat it differently than if, say, there were an immediate risk with smoking. So suppose that every time you smoke a cigarette, there's a chance that like you'll just get cancer just like really quickly, and then your like health will rapidly deteriorate like in just a moment. If that were the risk associated with smoking, it seems like smoking would be riskier than just like the long-term effects that actually occur with smoking. And so the idea here is that a delayed risk is less risky than an immediate risk. Okay. Finally, so in order to kind of avoid risk, engineers have a 5 kind of step protocol for safety, right? So designs have to accord with laws. Designs have to accord with the various standards in the engineering field, right? So if like one product is like meets the threshold of federal requirements, but is like significantly worse than all the other products on the market. Like you want your product to be at least equal to all the other ones on the market. Let's see, a safer design option needs to be entertained. So when we're designing a product, engineers need to think, okay, is there a safer way to like make the product, right? It requires a lot of creativity. Um, Fourth, an engineer needs to foresee various misuses of the product. So how is somebody going to use the product incorrectly? And like, how can we make sense of this? And how can we prevent that? So for instance, if I have like a push lawnmower and I'm like just being stupid and I turn the lawnmower over and like turn the blades on while it's upside down, is there a way that we can prevent or minimize risk at the misuse of the product? So um, maybe there's like a sensor in the wheels that like only when the wheels are on the ground will the blade come on, right? Something like that, right? And then finally, prototypes and products have to be tested, right? They have to undergo rigorous tests. You think about like all of these cars that just like slam into walls with the test dummies in them, right? That the car companies do. So anyway, so if we follow these 5 steps, the idea is we'll have a pretty safe design at the very least. Lastly, we have accidents. According to our author, there are 3 kinds of accidents. First of all, procedural accidents. And these are accidents that result from deviating from various established procedures, right? So if there's like a system that I'm supposed to do, right? Suppose I'm an airline pilot and I like start to do my own thing, right? And then something bad happens, that would be a procedural accident, right? Or if I do something that I think is part of the procedure, but it ends up not being part of the procedure, that would be a procedural accident, right? But basically the idea here is failures in the procedure. Then we have an engineering accident, which involves a flaw in a design, right? So for instance, suppose that my push lawnmower has no feature to keep it from coming on if I turn the lawnmower upside down and expose the blades, right? And I get hurt. We would say that uh, that's a kind of flaw in the design, and so my getting hurt at virtue of like turning the lawnmower over is kind of an engineering product accident. And then lastly, we have systemic accidents, which are like a collection of small accidents that take place over a complex system, and then lead to a horrendous outcome. So if you go back and you read the ValueJet Flight 592 case, you know, in the cases at the end of the chapter, you're going to see that that was an instance of a systemic accident, a whole bunch of tiny accidents or problems that amounted to the death of like 150 people. Okay. So anyway, we've talked about the nature of both safety and risk here. We've gone over some vocabulary terms, and we've talked about 3 different kinds of accidents. Thank you, everyone.